A new secret unlocked by DNA. Imagine an ancient graveyard, where bones thousands of years old lie buried beneath the earth. These people were once alive. They fought wars, fell in love, raised children, and eventually died. Their entire life story is hidden within their remains, but the most fascinating part is what's written in their DNA, where their ancestors came from, which routes they traveled, and how their descendants went on to reshape the world. Over the past few years, ancient genomics, the science of extracting and analyzing DNA from old bones and teeth, has given us a completely new lens through which to view European history. The most recent and most startling discovery concerns the origins of the Celtic languages and Celtic peoples. For centuries, historians and linguists wrestled with this question: where did Celtic languages and Celtic culture actually come from? Was it merely an idea that spread through trade and cultural contact, or was it the result of an actual large-scale human migration? Now genetic evidence has begun answering this question, and the answer is quite striking. A centuries-old question: who were the Celts? The Celts are most commonly associated with Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, a region of France, places where Celtic languages, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, are still spoken today. But there was once a time when Celtic culture and language covered a much larger territory, stretching from Central Europe through Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, Britain, and even parts of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. According to the traditional view, Celtic languages arrived in Britain during the Iron Age, roughly 2,400 years ago, alongside the Celtic art and inscriptions first found in Central Europe. But there has always been disagreement over when exactly did these languages spread. Where did they originate? Did they spread through an actual migration of people, or did they simply spread as a cultural trend, the way a language or fashion might spread today through trade routes without any large-scale movement of people? This question was difficult to answer because archaeology alone, pottery, weapons, or art styles, can't tell you whether a culture arrived with people or merely spread as an idea. As one researcher put it, without genetics, every theory was just up for debate. What DNA has newly revealed? The most comprehensive study to date analyzed the genomes of more than 750 ancient individuals, including samples from France, Germany, Austria, and the British Isles. These were the DNA of people from Bronze Age and Iron Age Europe, roughly 4,000 to 2,500 years old. The core aim of this research was to determine which theory best explains the spread of Celtic languages. Did they originate in Central Europe or somewhere else? The results showed a very clear signal. The Urnfield culture of Central Europe had a profound effect on people's genetics, and this influence spread throughout Western Europe. What was the Urnfield culture? The Urnfield culture gets its name because these people cremated their dead and stored the ashes in urns, clay vessels. Musanchiyus, hence Urnfields. This culture emerged roughly 3,300 to 3,200 years ago in Central Europe, in what is now Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic. Within this culture was a subgroup known as Knovis, found in the Carpathian Basin, modern-day Hungary, and the surrounding region. According to the research, ancestry linked to this Knovis group formed between 4,000 and 3,200 years ago, and then spread across much of Western Europe between roughly 3,200 and 2,800 years ago. This ancestry wasn't confined to Central Europe alone. Its influence was also found in the Hallstatt culture, spanning modern-day France, Germany, and Austria, and from there it spread further. In Britain, the impact of this ancestry appeared roughly 2,800 years ago. In Iberia, Spain, Portugal, this impact reached roughly 2,500 years ago. In other words, a single genetic signature traveled outward from Central Europe and spread across all of Western Europe, from Britain to Spain, and its timing lines up almost exactly with when Celtic languages themselves began appearing in these same regions. This wasn't just an idea spreading. Here's the key point. If a culture or language spreads purely through trade, the way English has spread across the world today without any massive migration of English speakers, you wouldn't expect to see such a clear shift in genetic ancestry. But this study showed that people's biological makeup itself was changing as this ancestry spread from one place to another. This means Celtic languages weren't simply learned. They genuinely traveled alongside people. Whole communities, men, women, children, actually left their homes and moved to settle new regions, carrying their language with them. This finding is significant because it shows that ancient population movements weren't small invasions that later vanished. They were genuine, large-scale demographic shifts that reshaped the entire genetic landscape of Western Europe. Earlier, evidence from Iberia. Before this new study, there was already research examining 8,000 years of history on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal. That research also traced how, across different eras, from the arrival of farming to the Bronze Age, new ancestries entered Iberia, The presence of Celtic-speaking peoples in Iberia, known as Celtiberians, supports the idea that ancestry originating in Central Europe didn't stop at Britain, but reached all the way to Spain, exactly as the newer study mentioned above also shows. Britain's story, the 2021 study. Even before this newer study, a separate major piece of research in 2021-2022 uncovered evidence of a large migration into Britain during the Bronze Age. Led by David Reich, a population geneticist at Harvard University, a team of more than 200 researchers conducted the largest ancient DNA study to date. An intriguing story emerged from this study at a site called Cliff's End Farm in Kent, England. About 30 kilometers north of Dover, the grave of an elderly woman was discovered. She had been buried carefully with 2 lambs placed in her lap and a piece of chalk in her hand. Her death had come from sword blows to the skull, possibly as part of a sacrificial ritual. Nearby lay the bodies of a teenager, 2 children, and a man whose bones had been bundled together with a copper-tipped cowbone. Isotope analysis of their teeth revealed that 2 of them had been born in continental Europe, meaning they weren't native to Britain but had come from elsewhere. These individuals may have been among the first wave of Celtic-speaking people to reach Britain. This research showed that around 2,900 years ago, a significant number of people arrived in Britain from Europe, and their DNA, whilst combined with that of nearly 800 other individuals, provided evidence of a previously unknown Great Migration. Interestingly, this study pointed to an early migration from France as a possible route by which Celtic languages reached Britain, which aligns well with the newer 2025 study's findings of a wider migration from Central Europe into Western Europe. What came before? Yamnaya and the steppe migration. It's important to understand that the Celtic-associated migration wasn't an isolated event. It was one link in a chain of several major migrations that shaped European history. The genetic makeup of modern Europeans is a mix of 3 fundamental ancestral groups. European hunter-gatherers, who settled Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, a very ancient era. Neolithic farmers, who spread from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, roughly 8,000 years ago, bringing farming with them. Steppe-related populations, who entered Europe roughly 4,500 years ago, during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, from the Pontic steppe, the grasslands of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia. These steppe-derived people were linked to the Yamnaya culture, and it's believed they brought the dialect of Indo-European into Europe that would later become the ancestor of the Celtic languages. So the story of Celtic languages doesn't begin with the Bronze Age Urnfield migration alone. Its roots trace back to the Yamnaya migration thousands of years earlier, which laid the Indo-European linguistic foundation in Europe. Seen this way, the history of the Celtic languages is the result of 2 major migration events. First, the Yamnaya migration, which brought the fundamental Indo-European linguistic root into Europe, roughly 4,500 years ago. Second, the Urnfield-Novies migration, which spread the Celtic branch, growing from that root across all of Western Europe, roughly 3,200 to 2,500 years ago. Dynastic succession, the secret of the Celtic elites. Another important study, published in 2024 in the journal Nature Human Behavior, found evidence of dynastic succession among the early Celtic elites of Central Europe, particularly within the Hallstatt culture. This means these communities weren't simply loosely organized groups. They had a family-based system of governance, in which power and status were passed down within families, similar to what we later see in many of Europe's royal dynasties. This finding suggests that Celtic society wasn't just a loose tribal culture, but had a clear social hierarchy and political structure, resembling to some degree an organized state. Population stability despite high mobility. Another significant study, Antonio et al., 2024, found that since the Iron Age, Europe's population structure has remained fairly stable, despite very high levels of mobility, people traveling from place to place. This means people traveled a great deal, engaged in trade, and even married people from other regions. But the overall genetic picture didn't shift as dramatically as it had during the Bronze Age. This makes the new Celtic migration study even more remarkable, because the genetic shift observed during the Bronze Age Urnfield migration was a unique event in itself, after which Europe's population became relatively stable. Comparison with the Anglo-Saxon migration. It's worth comparing the Celtic migration with the Anglo-Saxon migration. A 2022 study examined the Anglo-Saxon migration and showed how, during the early medieval period, Anglo-Saxon peoples reshaped England's gene pool. The key difference is timing. The Anglo-Saxon migration happened much later, roughly 1,500 years ago, whereas the Celtic-associated Urnfield migration occurred, roughly 2,800 to 3,200 years ago. Both migrations profoundly affected the genetics of Britain's population, but in different eras and from different directions. Beyond Iberia, similar research in South Asia Genetic research isn't confined to Europe alone. Similar techniques are being applied in South Asia as well. For example, a study of communities in the Thar Desert region, near the Rajasthan-Pakistan border, showed how migration, endogamy, marrying within one's own community, craft traditions, and ancestry linked to the Indus Valley shaped a complex genetic landscape there. This shows that the methodology of ancient genomics isn't limited to Europe. It's being used to understand history around the world, and it holds fascinating implications for people in Pakistan and South Asia as well. The Celtic language map. Today, Celtic languages survive only along the northwestern fringe of Europe. Goidelic branch, Irish and Scottish Gaelic, Brittonic branch, Welsh, and Breton. Interestingly, the Breton language, spoken today in France's Brittany region, actually migrated back to the continent from Britain, possibly due to pressure from Anglo-Saxon settlers as Celtic-speaking peoples fled Britain and resettled in Brittany. This shows that the history of Celtic languages isn't simply a straight-line migration story. It's a far more complex tale of movement back and forth, and even of return migrations. Why is this discovery so important? The significance of this research goes beyond simply learning about the history of the Celts. It carries deeper implications. 1. The link between language and genetics. This study strongly supports the idea that the spread of major language families is often tied to actual human migration, not just cultural diffusion. It also reinforces the broader story of Indo-European languages, which shows how Yamnia-style migrations spread this entire language family across Europe and Asia. 2. A new way of writing history. In the past, historians relied primarily on archaeology, pottery, weapons, buildings, and written records. Now, genetics has become a powerful third tool, capable of answering questions that artifacts alone could never resolve. 3. Impact on modern identity. People in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany take pride in their Celtic identity today. This new research adds even greater depth to their history, showing that their ancestors traveled a long journey from Central Europe centuries ago, carrying their language and culture with them. Criticism and disagreement. As with any major scientific discovery, this research has faced some pushback. Some linguists and archaeologists argue that the origin of Celtic languages may not be so straightforward. Several distinct waves and regional factors may be involved that a single genetic study can't fully capture. Additionally, the term Celtic itself is somewhat vague. Sometimes it refers to language, sometimes to an art style, and sometimes to a broader cultural identity. Genetics can only reveal biological ancestry, not language or culture directly, so researchers are careful to say that genetic patterns align with the spread of language, not that they prove it. It's not certain that everywhere this ancestry appears, Celtic language was necessarily spoken there too. It's also possible that in some regions, language spread without significant migration, while in others, migration played a much bigger role. The real picture is likely a mixed result of both factors. What's next? Future research. The field of ancient genomics is advancing rapidly. Each year, new samples, improved sequencing techniques, and better statistical models are making the picture of history clearer. In the coming years, we can likely expect greater geographic coverage. Most samples so far come from Western Europe. Getting more samples from Central and Eastern Europe, as well as North Africa, will complete the picture further. More precise timing. Better dating techniques are being used to pin down the exact timing and pace of migrations. Integration with cultural and linguistic evidence. Efforts are underway to combine genetics, archaeology, and historical linguistics into a more complete picture. Similar research worldwide, including South Asia. As the Thar Desert study shows, these methods are being applied around the globe, which means we may get new insights into our own history, including in Pakistan and South Asia as well. Final thoughts? Stories told by bones. Ancient genomics has taught us that every person's DNA holds the story of their entire lineage. That elderly woman buried with lambs at Cliff's End Farm, the young warrior with an iron sword, the Iberian woman buried with jewelry. These aren't just archaeological artifacts. They're characters in a much larger story, a story of people who rose up in Central Europe and carrying their language, culture, and DNA with them, spread across every corner of Western Europe. From Britain all the way to Iberia, it was this migration that, at least to a significant degree, gave birth to Celtic Europe. And this isn't just an old story. It also teaches us that humans have always been travelers, always carrying their languages and cultures with them, and that every great civilization in the world is, in some way, the result of a migration. The next time someone speaks in Irish or Scottish Gaelic, remember, the roots of their language stretch back thousands of years, bearing witness to a migration that once began in Central Europe, a secret only now being unlocked from the DNA of ancient bones.